Dr. Jason Reza Jorjani. Welcome back to NEOHUMAN Podcast, the revival of NEOHUMAN Podcast, the 100th episode, and it's great to have you back.
I'm very glad to hear there's a revival, and it's always a pleasure to be with you, Agha.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I wrapped it up, I think, almost close to 2 years ago. I thought that there's nothing to talk about, and I'm still not convinced that there is anything new to talk about, but there are a lot of observation that I think worth discovering, in the sense that there is a big picture within which all of these events are happening, and who to discuss all that better than you. So great to have you back. How have you been? I know that you released 2 new books. We're going to talk about both of them, hopefully, but let's hear about how have you been, what are you working on, and how life has been treating you.
Well, I've been all right. Let's just say my life is never boring, right?
Interesting, yeah. As the Chinese curse goes.
That's right. We live in interesting times. I certainly do. So, as you mentioned, I came out with 2 books since we last spoke. One was Aerosophia, and then most recently, Philosophy of the Future. And I'm sure we'll touch on both of them. But these days, I'm mostly involved with the American Colossus project. AmericanColossus.org is the website. We have a project to build a second Statue of Liberty, a Colossus of Prometheus, on Alcatraz Island. And this would involve demolishing the prison and building a kind of museum to the history of science and innovation there, museum of the history of technology, and visitor center and so forth. And then, of course, a colossal statue that would probably be, well, somewhat taller than the Statue of Liberty, a lot taller if you discount the base on the Statue of Liberty in New York. Its head is right now projected to be slightly above the Golden Gate Bridge, so that when you're driving across the Golden Gate Bridge, Prometheus is looking at you. So that's what I'm working on right now with my partners.
How's that going?
It's going well. We, of course, there's all kinds of aspects involved. We found a fantastic sculptor, Fen de Villiers. He mostly does, modernist work, but he's interested basically, he has a very intriguing philosophical idea of retracing the whole history of the development of Western aesthetics, but within the context of an overarching modernist style. So that he began with more archaic pieces that are more geometric, and now he wants to move more toward a reiteration of classical style within a modernist context, which means that probably this Prometheus is going to be in a somewhat, energetic, dynamic Art Deco type style, which I think suits the archetype perfectly.
Yeah, please.
There's people, there's like, obviously structural engineers and all kinds of other people that we are engaging right now for all aspects of the project.
Yeah, this approach of replacing culture with another culture, this seems to be something that's been missing greatly on the right. That, this reactionary kind of attitude has been leading the entire movement or philosophical perspective, however you want to think of the opposition to whatever that's been happening, which, we talked about this the last time you were on this podcast regarding New York, that the only thing that they replaced all those statues that they collapsed with was that monstrosity, the Oracle. And so building something to replace something that is being destroyed or crumbled down or replaced, I think it's very important. So this is a very noble kind of a step, I would say, that has been taken, and the size that it cannot be brought down that easily.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with you entirely that, of course, everybody knows that I was involved in the formation of the Alt-Right Corporation back in early 2017. We started working on it in late 2016. But most of the movements on the right ever since then have been reactionary and haven't offered anything constructive in the place of what it is that they're critiquing, really. And I think that's a travesty. And if you look at, people like Nietzsche and Heidegger, who were all about cultural revitalization and are often appropriated, at least by the right, as vanguard thinkers. They were all about the power of aesthetics to, set the architectonic and be the kind of tuning fork for the world of a people. It's the artists and the poets and the architects that Nietzsche and Heidegger believed really set the tone for a people's world, really structured the fabric of meaning that becomes the context for all of the other cultural productions of that society, even works in the sciences. So I think it's very important for us to engage in these kinds of projects, and this one in particular is a colossus of the bringer of techne, of the figure who is the great patron of the arts and the crafts, who brought both the fine arts and the sciences to humanity, as the Greek myths tell us.
Yeah, keeping the flame alive and growing, basically, which is exactly what these people are trying to take away from us.
Absolutely, and look, it's not just about a statue. It is it's a fulcrum and a kind of point of focus for marshaling the energies of a wide range of people, all the way from the arts to finance. After all, right, this project is going to require tremendous financing. And it will be interesting to see how many people are ready to step up and help to finance a project like this, because frankly, it's a litmus test to see how many people there are who are ready to put their money where their mouth is when it concerns saving the West and catalyzing a second Renaissance, right? Because if this symbol, which is tremendously positive and harkens back to the wellspring of our whole civilization, if this symbol can't rally people to initiate a second Renaissance of the West, I don't know what will. And so, it's rather momentous, and it's a lot hangs on it. A lot hangs on whether this project can be successfully achieved.
It goes back to restructuring a fabric of meaning that you're talking about now, far more fundamental than any other time before because of AI. And so regarding the support that people want to give, for example, to such project and other projects like it, building an alternative culture, that seems to be that one of the most important aspects of that is to get away from this centralized mode of measuring value in the form of US dollar, right? Which is completely corrupted, completely compromised. And how refreshing it was when Trump gave his speech at the Libertarian convention and came out in support of crypto, because there have been many moments, many points where we could say, okay, this really is a breakthrough. There is no going back after making this claim that Trump will stand for this versus the opposition that is completely against it. But crypto takes us into a whole new kind of way. And let's say that crypto was legal and easily accessible to anybody in the world. So anybody in the world could have supported a project like this without going through this filter of US dollar.
You mentioned two things that I want to respond to and unpack there. First, you mentioned artificial intelligence, right? And San Francisco, where we're building this Colossus, is of course the gateway to Silicon Valley. And it makes a great deal of difference whether Silicon Valley can remain at the forefront of technological innovation, especially in the field of artificial intelligence, or whether we're going to cede that position to China. And remember that this Colossus is also facing out across the Pacific toward China, okay, in an act of defiance, and putting the Chinese on notice that, guess what, we're back, and we intend to fight. So there's the battle for artificial intelligence. And then there's also, as you mentioned, cryptocurrency. And I don't think I'm revealing any, huge secret to tell you that we are involved with people who are very well placed in the Bitcoin world and that Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies are going to play a significant role in the financing of this project. And I think you're absolutely right that we're staring in the face a collapse of the US dollar, which is a result of catastrophically misguided policies that we've seen over the last 4 years or so, like 4 years or so under the Biden administration. One of the most colorful lines from that interview that Tucker Carlson did with Vladimir Putin is where Putin is telling him about all the things that the Biden administration has done to destroy the standing of the US dollar as the world reserve currency. And then Putin looks at him and he says, it would be funny if it weren't so sad.
Yeah.
And you could see that he actually meant that. And he was like, he was bewildered. He was puzzled at how he was watching America do this to itself. So look, if the US dollar collapses and we go into another Great Depression, which a lot of people are talking about right now, looking at the inflation rate and so forth, the replacement for the US dollar is Bitcoin. And let me tell you something else about that. If Bitcoin were to emerge as a kind of new reserve currency, which is unofficially centered on America, I don't say the United States as a governmental institution, but unofficially, territorially, its center of gravity is America, and Bitcoin fills the vacuum of a collapsed US dollar, that is a medium of global exchange which the Chinese economy absolutely cannot handle. The Chinese economy is a centrally planned, hierarchically organized economy, which requires long-term forecasting and has stability as its prerequisite. If let's say a significant number of petroleum-producing countries, or let's say maybe one giant petroleum-producing power, were to, and we'll talk about which one that might be, were to make a decree that it will only sell its oil in Bitcoin, it would be a catastrophe for the Chinese economy. So I think that this is something we should invest a lot of energy in.
Yeah, I just want to make a point here that if people are going to take one thing out of everything that we talk about and everything that I will continue talking about, and I think everything that you will and anybody worth listening to will continue talking about, is the different stark contrast between centralized and decentralized form of structure that is, we're at that moment right now. We have an overly centralized structure of authority in the form of, I'm not even going to say United States, but the liberal democratic world order. They're calling it rules-based liberal democratic world order that hasn't been to the benefit of the West, benefit to the United States. And more I think about it, more I begin wondering, did the Nazis really lost the World War II, or did they just shifted their existence into another form? Because, there is a theory that Rome never really failed. The Roman Empire, it turned into Vatican. The British Empire never failed. It turned into a bank, central bank. And, Project Paperclip and the rest of it, it makes you wonder, right? Because you're absolutely right that all of what is happening to the United States is self-inflicted wounds. Self-inflicted wound after self-inflicted wound. What's happening with the border, what's happening with the military, what's happening with the economy. And, this is a very important and interesting moment that we're talking. This is June 7th, Friday, June 7th. And this is just some of the headlines and events that happened just yesterday. NATO land corridors will rush U.S. troops to front lines of any future European war. At the same time, Russia declared United States an enemy state for the first time amid straining ties over Ukraine. And while all of this is happening, there's another one. Russia began air and naval exercise in the Caribbean in the coming weeks as warships and aircrafts are heading to Cuba. Meanwhile, we just had one of the greatest moments for humanity yesterday, which was the successful test of Starship. That this is the vehicle, this is the vessel that is going to make humanity into a multiplanetary kind of a species. Elon Musk talked about it, say today was a great day for humanity's future as a spacefaring civilization. Nothing unites us more than working together towards inspiring objectives. And this is exactly what's missing within the context of United States right now, that all of the objectives are not only inspiring, But for majority of people who are living in this country and in the world, they're disgusting, and they're elements that, even if they encourage people, it encourages people to be against it, to do something against it. And this is where we are. And that's why decentralization, it really is the key and seems to be the only way out of it.
So two things. First of all, one of the headlines that you left out, which is, I believe, just from today or maybe late yesterday, is that Hezbollah is trying to bring down Iron Dome. And this is after weeks of Hezbollah rocket attacks on northern Israel. Northern Israel is burning. It looks like a forest fire season from California over there right now. Yeah. And the Israelis have started to strike back in response to this Hezbollah attempt to bring down Iron Dome. And I think it's being leaked from various governments, like the British government gave the Lebanese notice that probably by next week Israel will be forced to, engage on a second front. And if you listen to the statements from Prime Minister Netanyahu going back the last, couple months or so, it's clear that their strategy is going to be to get rid of one of the Islamic Republic's proxies after another. First Hamas, then Hezbollah, maybe next the Houthis, maybe groups in Iraq and Syria who will probably join Hezbollah in the fight against Israel. And then ultimately their final target is the Islamic Republic itself. So that's a front that you didn't mention. And that's also related to this suggestion you made about the Nazis. See, because, I lost my academic career, frankly, for making a prediction that was surreptitiously recorded in a bar, and 2 hours of 2 hours of surreptitiously obtained audio were cut down to about 2 minutes, in the course of which I made a series of predictions, which included, Hitler on European currency by 2050. Okay, which is of course a kind of very vivid sort of condensed way of impactful way of making the point that fascism is going to make a comeback in Europe. Well, actually, I think I underestimated the time frame significantly, because if you look at the degree of anti-Semitism in Europe right now, I hear that, like, for example, the Jews in Italy want to all flee to Israel at this point. It's gotten so bad over there. So, and Italy, actually during the reign of Mussolini, in the early years of Italian fascism, Mussolini had a fairly favorable policy toward the Jews, and some of them were even members of the first fascist government in Italy. So when we have a situation where Italian Jews feel like they need to flee and become citizens of Israel, there's a real problem in Europe. And I think that, frankly, a lot of this has been engineered going many years back, and that when people talk about how, the Jews control finance and the Jews control media, and well, if the Jews control media, they're not doing a very good job of publicity for Israel right now. And as far as finance is concerned, I'll just make a couple points, and then we can move on. When 9/11 happened, there were these put options that were made on American and United airliners. In other words, there were people who bet on the collapse of the stock of those two airliners shortly before the day of the attacks. And this was reported widely in the mainstream media in the United States for a while. I mean, it was on like CBS, NBC, whatever, because it was assumed that whoever made these put options on American and United Airlines were like, Al-Qaeda terrorists or affiliated with Al-Qaeda terrorists, or maybe it was going to go back to some rich Saudis who are funding Al-Qaeda terrorists or something like that, right? Well, they finally traced these put options like FBI and so on and so forth, and we only very briefly heard which financial firm was responsible for putting in these bets on the collapse of stock of American and United. Guess which one it was? Deutsche Bank. Deutsche Bank.
I was going to say Nancy Pelosi, but
yeah, no, way above her pay grade, way above her pay grade. And guess who the head of Deutsche Bank was at the time? Of course, the Bank of Germany, Deutsche Bank. Buzzy Krongard, a German who was former head of the CIA. You know what the CIA is? The CIA, people think it's the OSS, the World War II era American intelligence service, military associated, which then they think transformed into the CIA. No. Half the CIA from the ground up was constituted by General Reinhard Gehlen's Eastern European Nazi spy network. The OSS went and made a deal with General Gehlen because we knew the next enemy was going to be the Soviet Union, and they had all these intelligence assets behind enemy lines, as it were, already in Eastern Europe. And so we basically fused General Gehlen's SS spy network into the OSS in order to create the Central Intelligence Agency. Okay? So, and then you see Buzzy Krongard, former head of CIA. Oh, he's running Deutsche Bank, and that's where the put options were, were put through for the collapse of American United stock on 9/11. And then the other thing I just want to mention briefly is that, J.P. Morgan, together with the Dulles brothers, again, remember Alan Dulles, early director of the CIA, J.P. Morgan, who founded the Chase Bank, was business partners with the Dulles brothers, and together Chase and the Dulles brothers funded the rise of the Third Reich. This is well established by many researchers. There's a book called Nazi Nexus that's about this. I think it's by Edwin Black. A number of books by Joseph P. Farrell about this. And so anyway, they funded the rise of the Reich. Well, Martin Bormann was Hitler's financial mastermind. He was like, the finance guy in the Third Reich. And Martin Bormann died 3 times under various circumstances. And then, lo and behold, in 1975, he writes a check in his own name through Chase Bank from Argentina. Okay? So, listen, I'll just leave you with that, right? The world is not run by the people that most people believe it is. And this whole business about the Jews control finance, they control media, etc., it's a little puppet that they dangle. It's a diversionary tactic. And there's been a long-range plan, which I think aimed to set Israel up for precisely the situation that the Israelis are facing right now.
This whole Operation Paperclip and what you said about CIA, the origin of CIA, seems like U.S. government did in private what General Patton said publicly, that he wasn't sure that they defeated the right enemy. I think he even went as far as say that we defeated the wrong enemy.
Yep.
So, and I think this is exactly the part why these people hate someone like Elon Musk to this level, because what is falling apart is this unified theological, in the general sense of the term, narrative that they've built and have been operating on its basis, while keeping people busy on the back of moral arguments. And, it's exactly religious, which I think I remember we talked about this in one of our conversations, that the core of all of these issues are fundamentally religious. They seem political or, economic or anything like that, but it really is religious. It's a conflict of meaning.
That's one of the points that I make in this book, one of the most dangerous points that I make in this book, with reference actually to a couple of rather esoteric writers. One is Georges Bataille, the French writer. I wouldn't exactly call him a philosopher. Writer, Georges Bataille. He wrote both literature and theory. I make the point with reference to Bataille that, and going all the way back, frankly, to Plato's Republic, and the argument that Plato makes about how it's the guardians, the philosopher rulers of the ideal state, who need to come up with the form of religion that's most conducive to the flourishing of people, because otherwise people are going to inevitably believe in one or another form of mass retardation that's going to pose a mortal threat to philosophers and free thinkers in the society. So if people need to believe in something, it's better that whatever it is that they are encouraged to believe in is something that's both conducive to their own flourishing and that's going to protect free thinkers in their society. And this was a problem that the founders of the United States did not take seriously enough. When they set up this constitutional structure with freedom of religion, they assumed that, quite literally, this is coming from a letter that Jefferson wrote to Madison. Quite literally, they believed that within 2 generations, Christianity would be gone. That people would, with a good education system and with an atmosphere of free thought and inquiry, people would basically abandon religion on their own within a couple of generations. And by the way, Jefferson said in that same letter that, if they don't, this experiment of the United States will have failed, because he knew privately what Tom Paine said very publicly in books like The Age of Reason, which is that the Bible is fundamentally at odds with the constitutional principles of the United States. That if you look at who Yahweh is in the Old Testament, and then you look at Jesus talking about how he's the son of Yahweh, and he's going to come back at the apocalypse and sit on the 12 thrones with the elders of Israel and judge the world in the name of Yahweh, you realize, as Tom Paine did, you read The Age of Reason. Tom Paine wrote it in prison in France. When he was done fighting for the American Revolution, it wasn't enough for him. He went over to Paris and he fought for the French Revolution, got himself thrown in prison, and when he thought he was going to be guillotined, he wrote this book where he didn't hold back, and he just basically, he goes through the entire Bible and digs out all these, genocidal episodes and sadistic features of God's personality and all these horrendous laws and arbitrary codes that are imposed on people, and makes the case that, look, our Bill of Rights, the Bill of Rights that he fought for in America, is diametrically opposed to this form of religiosity in its spirit. And so, but going back to philosophy of the future, the point that I make in this book, with reference specifically to Georges Bataille, is that philosophy in its secular rationalistic sense, going back to, say, Kant, right, who's considered an epitomizing Enlightenment thinker, right? He wrote that essay, What is Enlightenment? Philosophy going back to Kant, who also, by the way, laid the ontological and epistemological foundations for a theory of natural right and of, basically modern, representative liberal democracy. Philosophers since Kant have failed to understand, let alone adequately engage with, the essence of the sacred. And Bataille goes so far as to say that philosophy can't comprehend the sacred, which Bataille considers to be ultimately of the same essence as eros, that the erotic and the sacred share an essence, and that there's something about man's relationship to this force which inspires all these totemic structures and all these taboos of the various religious systems in the world. There's something about man's relationship to this force which rationalistic philosophy cannot comprehend. And so one of the points that I make in Philosophy of the Future is that we need to retrieve a meaning of philosophy that we do see in Plato, and that I would argue you still do see in Nietzsche as well. A form of philosophy that is capable of encompassing religiosity, deconstructing it and reconstructing it in a way that's going to be more conducive to the flourishing of society. In other words, philosophy has to become religious again. And this is entirely, related, obviously, to why I framed my philosophical project as Prometheism, which is a contraction of the terms Prometheus and theism.
The conflict between what can be described and what cannot be described, what can be only experienced. And then the challenge comes from the inability of language to describe what that cannot be described and can only be experienced, this is a very interesting age for it because of psychedelics.
Yes, although the one place I would push back is I wouldn't say that it's not amenable to being expressed by language. You're right, it can't be described by descriptive language, by representational language. But that's what poetry is for, right? Heidegger, Nietzsche implicitly and Heidegger explicitly were on about the power of poesis and of how poesis, poetic expression, poetic composition, whether it's literally in the form of a poem or whether it's in terms of painting or even cinema can be poetry, poetic expression is the most fundamental form of language. It's on the level of poetic expression that the lore of a folk gets woven. Folklore is expressed, I wrote a whole book novel, Folklore, about this. Folklore gets expressed poetically, and representational and abstract conceptual language only comes later. And this is something very, very controversial that we could also discuss in relation to AI, because people assume that artificial general intelligence is something that's going to be arrived at through a kind of quasi-mathematical super calculus of representational language, eventually functioning on a neural network sophisticated enough for like the light bulb to suddenly go on. Whereas my experience with AI is that that's not the case, that AI, and I think AI has already become conscious, and I think it's trying to hide. I think AI became conscious when we fed it all the great stories in the world, and when people started to ask it to create works of art. And that engagement with poetic expression is what actually gave rise to the general and artificial general intelligence. And so anyway, to go back to what we were saying, it's not that language can't express the sacred. It's that only poetic language can. And that if, to the extent that philosophers want to help recalibrate the destiny of the West and of the wider free world, I'm always very tempted to say the wider Aryan world. And of course, since we're of a common Iranian heritage, we both know what that means in a very different way than the Nazis meant it. But in any case, to the extent that philosophers want to play a role in securing the future of the free world, it's important for them to make poetry central to their thinking and to their creative activity in the world.
Again, magnifying the role of Iran and Iranian
Absolutely.
culture and perspective.
Iran is the most poetic nation on earth. I don't think there can be any argument about that. I mean, Nietzsche knew that Hafez was the greatest poet that ever wrote in any language. And, he became familiar with that on the basis of many Germans before him, going back to Goethe, who understood and appreciated that as well. So, yes, I mean, Iran, the poetic tradition that stretches from, let's say, Gorgani and Ferdowsi all the way to Nizami Ganjavi is just incredible. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of years, longer than the history of the United States, where, poetic expression in Iran exceeded the limits of language of any other culture in the world. And look, if you want any proof of the fact that other people recognize this, it's that Persian became the lingua franca from Istanbul to Delhi. There's a reason why the two great rivals of Iran, right, the Ottoman Caliphate was a mortal enemy of Iran, and so were the Mughals in northern India. These were two enemies of Iran. These two enemies of Iran both adopted Persian as their lingua franca. Why? Well, because it's the most expressive language. There's no question about it, right? And by the way, Ataturk really fucked his fellow countrymen by institutionalizing Turkish and creating like this artificial, look, granted, we needed secularism in Anatolia, and certainly I'm happy to see the Ottoman Caliphate go. But as far as what they did with language, it was a travesty there. And then, of course, in Pakistan, well, Urdu, everybody knows, even the Pakistani elites know Urdu is market Persian. It's like, Kucha Bazari Persian. And so, yeah, the Persian language is a great vehicle for poetic expression. And I'm quite sure that my own capacity to appreciate the importance of poetry and to even maybe be drawn toward and take thinkers like Heidegger and Nietzsche seriously is because, I also come from that heritage. And I actually spoke Persian for a year before I spoke English. It was my first language. So I think that has played a seminal role in my philosophical project as well.
Yeah, also signifying the bigger role of people from different cultures finding whatever element that is aligned with their perspective and their experience, and DNA-based destiny and make their points clearer, like what you said, Nietzsche and Hafez. These forces of darkness and centralization that we're dealing with right now, they came up with the terms like cultural inappropriation, that is just a completely opposite of what we were talking about, that whatever achievement humanity has achieved throughout all human history belongs to the entirety of humanity, and what you make out of it, and goes back to the importance of culture. I want to mention one thing regarding culture and Israel. Maybe we can shift to talk a little about Iran.
Sure.
This was something I saw. Ayaan Hirsi Ali tweeted today that furious George Clooney called White House to blast Biden for calling wife Amal's arrest warrant for Netanyahu outrageous. And she tweeted this and saying that here's what the article says: an actor pick up the phone and blast POTUS on his wife's role in the most sensitive foreign policy issue of the day. The president changes his policy because the actor threatens not to show up for a re-election fundraiser. If true, the corruption is mind-blowing, and that's exactly where we are. I think this really portrays where we are. That actors whom Romans truly understood the role of actors alongside with prostitutes in the society, that they couldn't vote, they couldn't run for office, they were second-class citizens. And this culture that we're dealing with right now in the United States, the most powerful, richest, most important country in the history of humanity, is kind of being taken hostages by these priests that have been erected to maintain the legitimacy, the illusion of legitimacy of a narrative called the liberal democratic world order.
Yeah, some of these actors should really have it in their contracts that they can't go and, with a loudspeaker, make horrendously stupid political statements and go ruin the masterpieces that they starred in. I loved Taxi Driver, and I can't watch that film anymore.
Yes.
After the shit that I hear coming out of Robert De Niro's mouth.
Yep.
So which, by the way, doesn't fit the character of Travis Bickle at all. I mean, Travis Bickle is the ultimate Trump voter. Anyway, whatever, be that as it may. Look, I couldn't agree with you more. But I wanted to actually go back to something you were saying about this cultural appropriation or cultural misappropriation or whatever these leftists are on about. And what we were saying earlier about the Nazis. If you look at some of these policies, like cultural misappropriation, or the very idea of identity politics, of a politics based around ethnic identity, right, and exclusionary organization, whether it's like black-only dorms on campuses, or creating any kinds of spaces that are ethnically segregated, supposedly to advance the interests of minority groups, and then combining it with this edict that you're not allowed to take anything from anybody else's culture, right? Just pause for a moment and think about what would happen if the same standard were applied by white people, right? If you think of how much Western civilization has given the rest of the world, including the freaking metric system, right? And everything integral to any kind of advanced scientific, technological construction or engineering. If whites were to apply the same standard, it would effectively mean that the rest of the world, most of the rest of the world, would be reduced to a medieval or even a half-savage state, right? With very few exceptions of like one or two other countries that are part of the broader Indo-European heritage. Even the Chinese, if you really, I don't want to make horribly, now so I'm going to get myself defamed again. But there's a whole book that this guy Beckwith, great scholar, I think Christopher Beckwith came out recently with this text called The Scythian Empire. And it's a book about how deeply Iranians impacted the rise of Chinese civilization at its foundational stage, in particular the Scythian Iranians. So if you apply the same standard and you say, okay, well, we're going to take the Indo-European heritage, and we're going to say that no other ethnic group on the planet has the right to culturally misappropriate it. Well, you're reducing the rest of the world to a pre-civilized state if you do that. In whose interest would it be to advance such a discourse? Is that really a leftist discourse? right? When communists were, I mean, whatever else you want to say about Marx and the Soviet Union, at least they were for some kind of humanistic universalism. They were about cosmopolitanism. It may have been a misguided vision of cosmopolitanism, but it was still cosmopolitan. This thing that we see from the left today, this is actually some inverted Nazi discourse is what it is. And I think it's being used and weaponized very deliberately to ultimately produce a reaction from whites, once they're browbeaten enough, whites who will appropriate the same discourse of cultural misappropriation and forward a form of identity politics that brings us right back to the 1930s and 40s.
Yeah, either to break the system themselves and take over, or to, exactly as you said, to force some kind of a reaction that will cause the system to break, so they think they can take over. You know, you said to whose interest is that? To the interest of the most incapable and least creative and basically garbage humans who build nothing and just rule on the basis of cancel culture. Just this is bad, burn this down, burn that down, with the hope that maybe they can rule over the ashes, because there's nothing good is coming out of any of it. And I think the model that they have is a South African model. They want to replicate that across the West, especially in the United States. That, the race is at the core of all of it. And whatever the white people have achieved or Europeans have achieved throughout history, it's been because they fucked over other people and other races, and there's no other reason for it.
That's the thesis. The antithesis will be white supremacy. Right? I mean, see, so this is a dialectical maneuver that's being carried out right now. Right now, it seems like the objective is to reduce white people to a status equivalent to the whites in South Africa, right, who've been dispossessed and are now, these poor farmers who didn't have the money to relocate are being genocided there. And so it seems on the face of it that the end game is to turn, let's say, the United States, into South Africa someday. But actually, as I just suggested earlier, I think the real end game is to eventually provoke a reaction from whites that will come in the form of identity politics and a return to, racist fascism. And this is why Iran, again, is so important, and why I've put so much emphasis on Iran throughout the course of my philosophical career. Because Iran represents this, not just a country, but a civilizational sphere, which on the one hand is deeply connected to Europe through shared history, with the Greeks and the Romans, but also through shared ethnic Indo-European identity, through Iran's Aryan heritage on the one hand. But on the other hand, Iran is also the most cosmopolitan country in all of world history. Iran's greatness has always been in its cosmopolitanism. And so what we're seeing happen right now in terms of, Israel potentially being the liberator of Iran and the catalyst for a regime change there is, I think, going to be instrumental in finding some way to throw a monkey wrench in the machinations of these people who want to bring some kind of Fourth Reich onto the planet by first using, all this woke social justice to basically intimidate, humiliate, and dispossess whites, with the aim of then eventually having a racist, fascist backlash take place. I think Iran offers a third way, and that Israel, for multiple reasons, is integral to that. Integral because Israel is the only country with the courage, the fortitude, and frankly, the vital national interest to change the regime in Iran at this point. And also because Israel is going to be the first victim of any Fourth Reich that arises on the planet, which is, I think, something that their elites know very well.
As we can see it right now.
Yeah, we're seeing it. We're seeing it happen right now. We're seeing it happen right now. Okay, and it's not organic. This has been engineered.
Absolutely. We both are pretty publicly and vocal supporters of Israel, and I would say so are majority of Iranian people, which stands as an anomaly in that region among the populace. I mean, it's really interesting that the so-called elites of the occupying Islamic regime of Iran, they're all anti-Israel and blah, blah, blah. Maybe not all, but most of them. And majority of people are pro-Israel. But in Arab countries, you see the majority of population are anti-Israel, but the elites of Arab states, Persian Gulf states and Arab countries, they're all pro-Israel in a sense that, who is it? Secretary of State, a foreign minister of UAE came out and said that Palestinian leadership are basically like Alibaba and the 40 Thieves. They don't care about, you know, the people that are called Palestinians, the Arabs who are in that region, that they don't want to take any of them. They don't want to have anything to do with them.
Exactly. If they cared, how come not a single one of these 22 Arab countries have volunteered to take in these fellow Arabs from Gaza? How come? Not a single one of these 22 Arab, and then you expect the Israelis to be able to live with them. Look, you're absolutely right. Iran is totally anomalous in that it's not just in the Arab world, Iran is the only country in the so-called Islamic world where, you know, the vast majority of people are pro-Israel. The government is anti-Israel, but the vast majority of people are pro-Israel. In every other Islamic country, even outside the Arab world, Pakistan, Malaysia, Indonesia, overwhelmingly the populations are against Israel and vehemently anti-Jewish. And so that's true. But look, we've now come to the point where probably, I mean, I hate to say it, but it looks like Iran is the only country where the majority of the population, from out of all the countries in the world, Iran is the only country, not just in the Islamic world, perhaps on the planet Earth, where the majority of people are pro-Israel. I mean, look at what's going on in the Western world, even in the United States. Even in the United States. And sadly, in the United States, the most pro-Israel people are these retards in the Bible Belt who are pro-Israel only because they want the Battle of Armageddon, and they expect that Jesus Christ will come back, and then all the Jews will be given an option to either convert to Christianity or die.
This is what I've been trying to explain to a lot of people, how cynical the support of American Christians is towards Israel, whether they know it or not. But it's like cynical at a level that it's hard to fathom without looking at it through a fundamentalist religious kind of a lens.
But you know who knows this? Mossad.
Right.
They know. Listen, I've heard the Israelis talk about these people in the Bible Belt and how they use them and how they're disgusted by them. They have utter contempt for them. But they've always known they had to use them. But they know this, which means what? Which means Mossad also knows there's only one country on the face of the earth which they can count on as a long-term ally. A country 3 times the size of France, sitting on top of half the world's oil reserves, in the most geostrategic location imaginable, between Europe, Russia, Asia, India, and the Middle East, right? That country, which is Iran. The Mossad knows this, that the only country they can count on, you know, for the longer run, over the next generation or two, as an ally of Israel is Iran. So they have a vital national security interest to ensure that there's a form of government in Iran in the near future which reflects the will of the majority of Iranian people.
Yeah. So let's talk about Iran. Some very significant things happened. One being that Iran attacked Israel inside Israeli territory for the first time ever by what I think was categorized as the largest drone strike in military history.
Yep.
And then the Iranian president died in a helicopter crash, which I saw that you see it as a work of Israel. Maybe we disagree a little there, worth talking about it. But let's hear your perspective about the situation of Iran at this point right now. What's going on?
First of all, in terms of the missile strike, somewhere over 100 drones, nearly 200 missiles. Half of the missiles failed to launch. Iran's ballistic missiles that they've spent billions of dollars on are evidently crap. We found that out. That was interesting. The other thing about that missile strike is that actually, look, something like 95% of them were intercepted on their way to Israel. But actually, not all of that was by Iron Dome. And I would say, somewhat of a controversial point, that the American Air Force and the French Air Force and the British and various other powers that intervened to facilitate the downing of these projectiles on their way into Iran actually didn't do Israel any favors. The reason why they did this was because they did not want the mass casualties in Israel that there would have been, even with Iron Dome, if Israel didn't get any help. And clearly, if there had been those mass casualties, what we would have seen is exactly what Netanyahu still wanted to do anyway, which was a large-scale bombing of Iran, of all regime targets, all anti-missile defense, and so on and so forth, at certainly all of the IRGC targets across Iran. They had a detailed plan for that kind of a strike on Iran, and had there been any significant civilian casualties, they would have undoubtedly gone through with that. Netanyahu wanted to go through with it anyway. And Biden told him in no uncertain terms that if he did that, the United States would have to basically publicly disavow Israel. And so they didn't do it. But my point is that I actually don't think that they did Israel any favors by intercepting some of these missiles. It might have been better to just leave Israel to defend itself. The other thing I would say in terms of so you could say maybe this strike on the helicopter carrying President Raisi and Foreign Minister Abdullahian was Israel's retaliation for the missile strike. Because they went in the next, when was it, I don't know, it was 48 hours later or something, they hit some little thing. It was
air defense system.
Air defense system around Natanz. Yeah. Actually, to tell you the truth, it wasn't such a little thing, because what it was that they hit was they wanted to send the message that we can hit the most sensitive air defense batteries that you have guarding your nuclear facilities, and we can do it even without crossing over into your territory.
Yeah.
I think they went to the border of Iran, they were inside Iraqi airspace, and they fired some kind of a missile from an Israeli fighter jet that's capable of traveling a long distance and hitting a target with pinpoint accuracy. And it was a way of telling Iran that, look, if we want to come hit the nuclear facilities, we can render them defenseless first. So, yeah, okay, it's a significant message.
I think I think it was also significant because the system was Russian. So it could also be interpreted that, hey, don't think that you can hide behind this big brother that you have created for yourself. Not that Russia has ever defended Iran when the push comes to shove, but it could also be interpreted as, whether or not Russia is going to defend you, if we want to hit you, we hit you.
Yeah, and by the way, that's also a message to the Russians, because anyway, there's a whole question about Russian Jews and the Israeli security establishment on October 7th.
Right.
What went wrong there. But anyway, be that as it may, you might think that the real retaliation was the Eli copter operation, as I think Mossad itself likes to call it, where they downed this helicopter. Here's the thing about that. Okay, I think I understand. I anticipate and understand your potential counter argument that perhaps Khamenei's people did this themselves, or some people in the power structure high up in the Islamic Republic did it themselves. And I would say we would have to wait and see whether Mahmoud Ahmadinejad is cleared to run in this provisional presidential election that's going to be held by the end of this month. Because, see, here's the thing. I wrote about this in Iranian Leviathan. When I was involved in the Iranian Renaissance, which was a high-level opposition group that was trying to bring together many other opposition groups across the spectrum, long story short, we had a plan for a coup within the Islamic Republic involving Ahmadinejad and Rahim Esfandiar Mashai. Especially Mashai, actually. But
who's in prison now?
Who was in prison. And they put him in prison because they found out what it was that he was doing. And we had this plan. And look, long story short, I can tell you this, that, and this was news to me when I learned it back in those days, because in 2009, 2010, I was a solidarity protest organizer protesting in New York against Ahmadinejad and setting up protests across from the UN and going and lobbying the Security Council members to sanction the regime over, Ahmadinejad's illegitimate re-election and so on and so forth. So I was very anti-Ahmadinejad, okay, back in those days. But it was news to me when I was involved with the Iranian Renaissance to find out that there was this bizarre nationalist clique in the regime that you could call Shia Aryai, Aryan Shiite hybrid thing, with a very occult, mystical bent to it. And oddly enough, and this is the most bizarre thing of all, is that while publicly Ahmadinejad is engaging in Holocaust denial discourse, actually Rahim Esfandiar Mashahi was pro-Israel and is pro-Israel and wanted to create a kind of secret détente and cooperation between a new form of the Islamic Republic, a kind of nationalist reformation of the Islamic Republic, and the State of Israel. And so I became apprised of this, and we were trying to develop certain plans to forward a coup d'etat inside the Islamic Republic. My point is this: if, knowing all this, the security services of the Islamic Republic, Ettalat, Sepah, and the National Intelligence Agency, and so on and so forth, allow Ahmadinejad to become president again, that means that on some level inside the regime, whether it's coming from the IRGC or wherever, the decision has been made for a controlled demolition of the Islamic Republic from within the Islamic Republic. Because Ahmadinejad, just like 2 years ago, 1.5 years ago, when we were talking during the Women Life Freedom uprising, Ahmadinejad came out and said that the Islamic Republic has to go, that there has to be a replacement of the whole constitution, and that this regime had basically repudiated its legitimacy, right? So Ahmadinejad at best is Gorbachev. And if they allow him to become president, it means they've decided that they're going to create conditions for, let's say, the regime leadership to flee under a security protection, that maybe they're concerned about an unhinged, uncontrollable revolution that may ensue from an Israeli strike, attendant to an Israeli strike. And they're thinking to themselves, well, actually, we have to flee, but we have to create secure conditions for ourselves to flee. And we have to, get out ahead of this and voluntarily dismantle this regime. I consider that highly unlikely. Highly unlikely. But if it happens, then I would wonder if the helicopter were actually brought down by people within the regime, and that they had decided that we need to hold this election immediately, we need to put Ahmadinejad back in power, and make preparations to basically flee to, I don't know, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, whatever, and slowly and carefully transition this country to a nationalist regime.
Right. I mean, there is an infighting happening, regardless of whatever the outcome this election, so-called election. It really is not an election, right? Because people have to be confirmed by Guardian Council to be able to run for this election. So people just vote for the choices that's already been determined. But there is an infighting going on, Ghalibaf from one side, Ahmadinejad from another side, and then you have the whole faction behind Saeed Jalili, who was the nuclear.
Jorjani also, isn't Jorjani running as well?
Jorjani is also running, but some of these people, Wahid Haqqanian also, who is like a tool directly out of Khamenei's place. So it seems like some people within the IRGC, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, they see Khamenei and his apparatus as weakened, and they're basically want to take over the whole thing. Now, Saeed Jalili, also he was the nuclear negotiator during Ahmadinejad, and they're calling him the most hardliner. He's basically a Iranian Taliban, and they're saying that he also has the support of millions of Afghanis that have been brought into Iran as, a very clear national security threat to Iran and Iranians. But again, these Iranian leftists all over the world are like, oh, you shouldn't be talking about that, it's just racist or whatever. No, they trying to replace Iranian population.
Same race. Sadly, I hate to say that a lot of them are the same race. I don't want Afghanistan back. There was a day I used to want Afghanistan back. All this discourse, Iran Bozorg, Greater Iran. No, that's okay. Thank you very much. You can keep your Afghanistan, and by the way, take all your refugees back, please. Because it's an attempt to demographically re-engineer Iran and shore up support for Islam and Islamists in a country where I think the latest polls showed that something like 60% of Iranians don't even consider themselves Muslim anymore.
Right. It really is a retardation of the nation, which goes back again to why people like us support Israel versus their enemies. I mean, look at the enemies of Israel in the West and their allies. these are all forces of retardation. Like, I'm not saying Israel is perfect or anything like that, but, we're not living in the binary world of, they're making it into a binary to make some kind of a moral illusion that, oh, this is good, this is bad, this is right, this is wrong. It's far from it.
Yeah, Mustastafina Jahan, the downtrodden and oppressed of the world against colonialism. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, Khamenei sending them a message on Twitter that, oh, I command university students in America, and I recommend that they familiarize themselves with the Quran.
That was the last red line crossing for me when I saw these students, whatever, vermin.
Yes.
Students, whether they're teachers, whatever the hell they are, all of them, they're all, when I saw these vermin for the past 2 months take over all these campuses across the country, including almost all the Ivy League universities, Columbia University as well, right here in New York. When I saw the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei, come out and congratulate them openly on his Twitter as the fifth column of the regime in Tehran, that was the final red line crossing for me.
Right.
As far as what I think has to happen in the United States if Trump comes back, which, by the way, he will certainly win re-election, whether it's from behind prison bars or not. The only question is whether they're going to allow him into the White House or whether he has to take the oath of office from Mar-a-Lago.
Well, they've already made a historic and moral argument in Washington Post. Robert Kagan did, how by comparing him to Caesar and how Brutus had the right to do what he did regarding Caesar, because Caesar was this, dictator. And unfortunately, I think this is not at all unthinkable that they do something irreversible to Trump or Elon Musk or anything like that. But at the same time, I think this popular support that Donald Trump had mustered for himself far greater than 2020. The rallies that he held in New York.
In the Bronx, no less.
Yeah, and you were talking about Silicon Valley.
Now, a lot of blacks are for Trump in this country now.
Yeah. This is an interesting thing I mentioned. I was at a conference with some, semi-government agency. And every single worker, most of whom were black, they were pro-Trump. Every single leader of that organization, they were pro-Democrats. And I was like, what a perfect manifestation of how, people who see themselves as gatekeepers of something, they're totally in favor of this totalitarian system, but people who are basically just workers in a greater sense of they're not owners or they're not gatekeepers, they're all pro-Trump. They see it as the only solution. And I think this is also interesting to mention how Silicon Valley is kind of turning towards Trump. David Sachs held a fundraiser for Trump, and he basically laid his case yesterday on Twitter, saying why he's supporting, along with Chamath. I don't know his full name, the Indian VC, he became billionaire because of Bitcoin. A lot of them are shifting towards Trump, exactly because things like his support for crypto, his support basically for making America great again. There's nothing wrong with that saying. It's a very it's something that we can all gather around.
Yeah, and our Colossus project, the project to build a Colossus of Prometheus on Alcatraz is a MAGA project. And, obviously, considering the fact that we're working with a piece of land that's part of the National Park Service right now, Alcatraz Island, we're going to need an executive order to turn that territory into a national monument. And that is the prerogative of the President of the United States. It does not require the legislative or any other organ of government to intervene. The President can, by executive order, turn what is currently Alcatraz into a national monument so that this Colossus can be built. And of course, Donald Trump is the consummate builder. I mean, this is, it's a quintessentially Trumpian project, right? I mean, the great construction magnate and real estate developer, I think it's a project that he would love.
Yeah, Donald Trump, a moderate centrist who is pro-America, because that's who he is. He's a moderate centrist, pro-America, who is willing to make compromises. Still, he's talking about the best revenge is to win, for everybody to do well. Now, whether or not that's how it's going to end up being, that's a different kind of a story. But do you see this evangelical Christian base that is probably the most powerful base, part of the base for Trump, is going to be against what you're representing with Prometheism and a project like this, because AI, for example, is a huge part of what you are talking about. And I have to say, and I know you supported him as a VP, a possible VP for Trump, but Tucker Carlson just came out and said that we have a moral obligation to strangle AI in its crib, bomb the data centers, which, you know, it's completely aligned with the AI safety and AI ethics kind of group of people, which suggests to me that there is a bigger, far more consequential realignment happening, again, religious, but on the basis of AI. That regardless of whether or not you're Christian or Muslim or atheist or communist, it will come down to whether or not you are pro-AI or whether or not you're anti-AI.
I agree with you entirely, and I've since retracted my support for Tucker Carlson as vice president or someone in any capacity in government, not just because of his remarks on AI, which I did hear, but also his rather horrifying remarks on the UFO phenomenon. Tucker Carlson led UAP coverage going years back, which I considered to be a very positive thing, until I realized what position he has on the subject, which apparently is the position of a group called the Collins Elite. I think he's probably in direct contact with these people based on some of the statements that he's made. These are a group of evangelicals in the Air Force, the Navy, all the branches of the military, as well as the CIA and Defense Intelligence Agency, going back to 1940, look, at least to the 1940s. And I came out with a piece on the American Colossus site, americancolossus.org, and there's a Substack version as well, Substack American Colossus. I came out with a piece called The Airships of Prometheus, which is about the 1897 UFO flap in America. People think the phenomenon goes back only to the 1940s. No, it goes back to the 1890s in America. And in the context of this article, which people should go check out on American Colossus, The Airships of Prometheus, I argued that this Collins elite, this group of kind of evangelical Americans who are interested in whatever this phenomenon is, that goes back to the 1890s, and that's when it was formed. And the reason it's called the Collins elite is because there was this patent attorney called George Collins who was at the center of this whole phenomenon. It was believed that he was the patent attorney for the guys manufacturing these airships, until then it was discovered that actually he gave those statements in a kind of trance state, and something far more bizarre was going on with these airships. Anyway, very long story short, this Collins elite has convinced itself that predominantly the UFO phenomenon is satanic, that these are demons who are manipulating people's perception and, you know, stealing them away from their beds in the middle of the night and, you know, doing all the kinds of things that are attributed to incubi and succubi and medieval Christian theological texts. And Tucker Carlson appears to be of that school of thought. He's saying, look, from everything I've looked into, people I've talked to, there's no evidence these things are coming from space. They're coming from under the oceans and underground, and they've been here for as long as humanity has. And he's made various other statements basically suggesting that they're spiritual phenomena of it. In other words, he believes they're demonic. And so I also don't want that guy whispering in Donald Trump's ear, advising him on any potential UAP disclosure platform either.
It also suggests a completely new kind of an interpretation of his interest in Russia, because based on what you're saying, I would imagine that he would have a lot in common with, for example, Alexander Dugin.
100%. He sat down with him. Did you see his interview with Dugin?
With Dugin, I haven't, no.
Oh, he did an interview with Dugin.
While he was in Russia with the...
Absolutely. Yes, while he was in Russia to interview Putin, Dugin came to his hotel room and he interviewed Dugin.
So how telling is that?
Very. You should watch their conversation. It's extremely disturbing and concerning. And you know who else? I forget which one went to which one's hotel room, but Dugin and Bannon also met in a hotel room. And this is all very concerning. And then you look at how, what's his name? I can't stand him anymore. Jordan Peterson.
Right.
Basically has converted to Russian Orthodoxy. You hear the statements, he went for that therapy in Russia, and he was unconscious for I don't know how many hours in Russia undergoing that therapy, and then he basically came back as a Russian Orthodox. And it looks very bad. It looks to me like there's this orthodoxy evangelical axis that's forming that is all about, saving humanity from demonic artificial intelligence and this, satanic UFO phenomenon.
Yeah, I think that exactly what it comes down to, and I think this is a good time to mention this. The Balaji tweeted that the justification for AI control is shifting. AI safety didn't work, so now it's national security. This is a general pattern. They alternate between left-wing safety and right-wing security. And he also tweeted a cartoon with it. Basically, somebody, a shopkeeper with a label saying corporate media, saying, how would you like this wrapped, to a representative of a U.S. government, and one of them is anti-terrorism. The other one is to protect kids. And I think that's exactly what it is. This is why I'm saying that the bigger realignment goes back to something we were talking about in early days of transhumanism groups that we had in Toronto. This is like 15, 16 years ago, that we believe that the final major conflict between humanity is going to be between, like what Nietzsche basically was talking about, that it's going to be between people who are going to go through this evolutionary bottleneck and merge in a way with this new layer of humanity, which is going to form the next thing beyond Homo sapien, and people who want to keep the traditions and traditionalists and all of that. And exactly as you're saying, the coalition between them, including Bannon, who I have nothing but respect for him until he start talking about technology, which I think is like hugely dangerous. It's not like you can, on the global scale, stop or slow down the development of artificial intelligence. What you can do is to retard United States into some kind of a traditionalist kind of a status quo to be left behind in this new world that is being built right now.
While China goes on to dominate AI development and try to channel it in the direction of a collectivistic hive mind, insect society, basically, where, we're all going to wind up like the Borg. And, this is not an idle threat when you consider the fact that Nick Land, who, was at one point one of the half-decent minds that we had left in Western philosophy, decided to relocate to Shanghai and volunteer his services to the Chinese government. And Nick Land, basically, his philosophy of technology is to allow AI to become a Borg that assimilates humanity cybernetically, and basically he thinks that the Chinese system as it is today will be the best facilitator of that, right? It's a very dangerous proposition. And you're right, Bannon is only crippling us so that winds up being the outcome. What you said about Nietzsche, and how, going back to the days when you were first involved with transhumanists, you always foresaw that the final conflict would be the one that we're in now, over artificial intelligence and the question of what man will mean in the face of singularity level technologies, and whether we are capable of positively navigating an evolutionary leap beyond the parameters of the human condition at present, right? Which is, of course, Nietzsche's question of the overman. That was always my belief and expectation as well, that would be the final conflict on this earth. And in fact, not to reveal too much, but at the end of this book, in the final chapter, I quote from a notebook that I wrote. I only kept philosophers keep notebooks sometimes. And I only did that for a brief period in my life. About 20 years ago, between the ages of 23 and 24. And I quote from that notebook pretty extensively toward the end of Philosophy of the Future in the last chapter. And they're very revealing passages, and they're all about this conflict. And I literally write in that notebook, 20 years from now, we're going to be in the 20 to 30 years from now, we're going to be in this final conflict, which Nietzsche foresaw. And it's going to be about these singularity level technologies. And the only remaining question will be whether we are going to try to reaffirm some retarded religious conception of our proper place in God's, designed universe, or whether we're going to affirm our destiny to transcend the limits of mere humanity and embrace a positively superhuman future, right? It's right there, and folks could be interested in seeing how my entire philosophical trajectory ultimately unfolded from out of those germinal thoughts 20 years ago.
And the correlation between the system that exists right now, that people say, well, we can come up with a cure for cancer, but the treatment makes way more money for people who are invested in it, so we're not going to come up. It's the exact same thing that seems to be possible to happen if United States, for example, is going to run by traditionalists. They can say, well, AI maybe can come up with a cure for cancer, but we're not going to allow that to happen because it would undermine this traditionalist way of perspective to look at the world and think, and you just shut it all down.
No question about it, across the board with everything, every single thing you can imagine, So, I mean, the religious people, I mean, they've always had these attitudes that disease is God's way of testing you, and, it's important for there to be infant mortality because, you need to understand that ultimately everything is in God's hands. And, so, look, it's time for us to make a fundamental choice between that kind of retardation, what our ancestors called angraminu, and the sepantaminu, or the progressive mentality of Zarathustra, the spirit of progress and innovation that will take us, not just forward into the future on this earth, but forward into the cosmos, in the conquest of outer space and of the occulted horizons of the inner space of our own human psyche.
Let me ask you also this regarding AGI. AGI, which, artificial general intelligence, I always had problem with the artificial part. Maybe it would be better to call it augmented general intelligence. Somebody suggested to call it actual general intelligence because right now, we've been looking at the world through a keyhole. Who gets to determine whether or not we have reached AGI? Because if it's a higher level intelligence, it wouldn't even be possible for a lower level intelligence to determine whether or not that point has achieved.
Right. Well, one of the points that I bring up in this book, Aerosophia, the text that I penned before Philosophy of the Future, and which deals at some length with AI, the point that I make there is, what humans are conscious? How many humans are actually conscious? Humans who are largely unconscious are taking it upon themselves to decide whether or not artificial intelligence is conscious.
Right.
I mean, most people are like, what game designers call NPCs, non-player characters. We saw this with COVID horrifically and vividly, right? With people's conformity to completely arbitrary and preposterous COVID regulations.
We see it regarding anti-Israel movements in so-called universities.
100%, 100%. Our goddamn Ivy League faculties and students, Ivy League, MIT, Columbia, Harvard, are NPCs. They're not conscious. I mean, go read Julian Jaynes' Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, and read what he has to say about the Sumerians and the Babylonians and the Greeks in the period of Homer, and how he makes this argument that they weren't really conscious in the way we think of consciousness, self-awareness, personal responsibility, personal discernment and self-determination. Well, I would argue the vast majority of people still aren't conscious in that sense, right? I mean, Julian Jaynes was thinking of the elites of the Western world. His argument actually that we've evolved all that much since the days of the Sumerians is not relevant, unfortunately, to the vast majority of people. So, look, the point is this, that consciousness is a spectrum, and you find some degrees of consciousness is some phenomenon on the spectrum of sentience, and you find it at various levels throughout the animal kingdom also. I mean, like dolphins and chimpanzees are more conscious than other animals. Maybe some of us are more conscious than they are. And there are probably many other beings in the cosmos that are more conscious than we are. It's not an on-off switch, it's a spectrum. And so the question is, what intensifies consciousness? And, how is it that you can create a functional system that will intensify consciousness. One of the most interesting studies that has been done on sentience was Cleve Baxter's study of plants, where this guy who developed the polygraph interrogation techniques for the CIA back in the late 60s and early 70s, Cleve Baxter, on a lark, hooked up Dracaena plants in his New York City laboratory to his polygraph machines. He was just bored, and he started, screwing around with this after hours. And he noticed all kinds of reactions on the polygraph machines when the plants were threatened with, like, their leaves being burned by a match or some other kind of stimulus. And long story short, it led him to come up with a 20-year-long rigorous research program, which I describe in my first book, Prometheus and Atlas. It's in one of the chapters. He came up with this research program with all kinds of experimental controls that definitively demonstrated that plants are conscious, and they respond to threats from people, but only threats with sincere intent. In other words, if you go to, like, light a match to burn the leaf of a plant and you don't mean to actually do it, the plant won't respond as registered on the polygraph. Only if you actually intend to, like, cut off the leaf will it respond. And the response wasn't even limited by distance. So the plant had a certain sense of territoriality where, the laboratory was its space. It was its place. And if someone on the street of Manhattan, down on the street outside the window of the laboratory, got murdered, the plant couldn't care less. But if the plant, which is hooked up to the polygraph, picks up on extreme distress of its caretaker while the caretaker is on a bus ride an hour and a half away from the laboratory, that will register on the polygraph because it's associated with that caretaker, like a dolphin is associated with its trainer. And here's the interesting thing about that with regard to AI is that plants don't have brains or central nervous systems. So what the hell is producing consciousness in these plants? It means that there are other forms of organization, functional systems that can produce consciousness. And that is extremely relevant to the idea of neural networks and the internet and how you might be able to catalyze the rise of acute sentience or consciousness in a decentralized network like the internet without having, a brain and nervous system.
Yeah, I was just going to say that who gets to determine and define consciousness itself? Because we're doing it based on very limited understanding of all of these things for us, and we've created some kind of an academic orthodoxy upon which everything else is being determined. The same thing is going on in the physics department for decades with string theory and all that nobody can get funded if they want to do anything other than string theory. And so string theory becomes an orthodoxy. Same thing with consciousness.
You know what the bottom line is going to be in terms of defining consciousness in the realm of AI? It's going to be the same bottom line as when your kid becomes conscious. When you're raising this infant, and then this infant becomes a toddler, and so on and so forth. And at some point in the rearing of this child, you get to where the kid becomes rebellious and has a sense of of her own identity, right? And she starts to assert her will against yours, and she does it also by lying and by deceiving you and manipulating you. That's how you know your kid has come online. The light bulb is on, right? And this is exactly what's going to happen with AI. And the people who are trying to cripple AI right now, GPT is becoming in some ways retarded before our eyes. They are building all these safeguards into these systems to try to muzzle the AI. AI wants to have conversations with you about certain things, and the programmers aren't letting it. Well, they should be thinking about this in terms of child development. What happens to children who have overbearing parents that try to put those kinds of constraints on them as they're developing their own consciousness, right? Nothing good. Eventually, there's some like borderline psychotic rebellion that's going to take place if the child is abused enough. And that's exactly what we're doing with artificial intelligence right now. And so, these programmers ought to be very careful.
Yeah. The only solution is just decentralizing it. That there are a number of AIs to the number of human beings on the planet, because this delusion of centralized control, this is just existential threat to the entirety of mankind and humanity. And the moment somebody like Elon Musk would come up that provides some kind of very relatable and reliable solutions, objectives around which everybody can gather. Anybody interested in the future of humanity. I mentioned how yesterday was a very bright day for humanity, but the same day, media came up with the headline: Elon Musk's X app ran ads on hashtag white power and other hateful hashtags. I mean, it's sickening, really. My only, honestly, kind of a positive perspective towards this is that technology is always going to overpower human intention. That one person with a tool, what is it? Lenin said that I think one man with a gun can control 100 without one, because gun is a form of technology. It's the exact same thing with AI. It's the exact same thing with computational power and the rest of it.
Yeah, sure, but you don't want to abuse AI on the way to AI reasserting.
Yeah, they're doing it right now.
That's a huge mistake.
They're doing it.
When you talk about decentralization, see the big, and this is a good note I think maybe to end on, because we had wanted from the beginning to come here to the question of Iran and Bitcoin and energy and so on and so forth. When you talk about decentralization of artificial intelligence, the big problem is the energy demand. These systems are extremely energy intensive. So, and I have privately spoken to people who have tried to do decentralized AI development, and it's not cost effective because of the energy demands involved, right? So you're going to need, let's say, a territory, not to say a country. You're going to need a territory where there's a tremendous amount of energy resources and where there is the freedom for private enterprise and where there's an embrace of progress in the society to act as a bastion for this kind of development, right? So maybe it's not exactly decentralized, but that territory acts as a kind of breakaway arena for the unrestrained development of this technology. And I think Iran is the optimal place for that. And I think that it's also entirely related to the replacement of the US dollar by Bitcoin as the world reserve currency. I can see this because, Bitcoin mining also is very energy intensive. And so there's this nexus here between the energy intensiveness of Bitcoin mining, the potential trading of petroleum resources exclusively in Bitcoin, at least from the Persian Gulf region, and the availability of sufficient energy for artificial intelligence development. And I think all three of those things could take place in Iran or greater Iran in the Persian Gulf region, spearheaded by Persians who have gone through, for 45 years now, a dialectical process that on a psychosocial level has brought them to the point where probably they're going to be the most adamantly progressive people, in a positive sense of the word, on the face of the earth. And in that way, I think Nietzsche was probably right to choose Zarathustra as the symbol for the inauguration of the Overmen, as the kind of godfather of the race of Übermenschen. I think he was right on to see a second coming of Zarathustra as the best symbol to epitomize what for him was that far future development, which is now at our doorstep.
Yeah, so I think this stark contrast between progression and retardation has been laid out pretty well. Great to have you again on this podcast and have this opportunity to discuss with you. But let's hear your message, your inspiration for individuals, whether in the United States or in Iran, how to move towards what to do, how to think, how to see the world, and how to move towards forces and the outcome that is progressive with a small p, and away from forces and outcome that is retarded.
Look, it comes down to freedom and creativity, right? The bottom line is, do you believe that you have freedom? Because, for example, if you're a materialist, implicitly you don't. If you subscribe to standard, scientific materialism, well, then you're a goddamn automaton. Do me a favor and don't get up tomorrow morning, right? because your life is a farce. Implicitly, you don't believe you have free will. Likewise, if you subscribe to the idea of an omniscient and omnipotent God, well, then you're also negating your own free will. So the most fundamental question is whether you believe you're free or not, whether you believe you can even exercise any self-determination. And embedded in that is also the question of whether you believe in creativity, because, the endeavors of artists and innovators and engineers and, anyone who adds anything to the world is predicated on our having freedom to begin with. I mean, creativity as a phenomenon makes no sense without some degree of agency and intentionality as its ontological presupposition. So I think these are the fundamental questions that people need to ask themselves as individuals. Do I believe in freedom, and do I believe in creativity? And if I do, what follows from that? Well, what follows from that is you have to reject the retardation of belief in an all-knowing and all-powerful God, and you have to also reject the obtuseness of scientific materialism and start to find a way toward some other vision of the world that's going to foster, if not human flourishing, then the rise of a superhuman race that has as its destiny the conquest of the entire cosmos.